Recent reporting from the Wall Street Journal writes that the United States funded scientist Benjamin Hu is one of the 3 Chinese researchers to reportedly fall ill during the early outbreak of COVID-19, according to current and former U.S. officials. Hu was a scientist at the Wuhan Institute of Virology who had done research on how coronaviruses infect humans. The officials reportedly told the Journal that the other 2 scientists who fell ill were Yu Ping and Yan Zhu. Now, this confirms a report from journalist and friend of the show, Michael Shellenberger, and also Matt Taibbi and Alex Gutentag, which named Ben Hu, Yu Ping, and Yan Zhu as 3 of the earliest people to become infected with SARS-CoV-2. According to sources in the United States government, Hu reportedly led the Wuhan Institute's gain-of-function research on, quote, SARS-like coronaviruses.
In response to news yesterday that President Joe Biden missed a deadline he signed that called for the declassification of possible links to COVID origins, Intercept D.C. Bureau Chief Ryan Grim tweeted, Biden is breaking the law by refusing to declassify information Congress ordered him to declassify. This is the public's information, not Biden's. Joining us now to discuss all of this is Twitter Files author Michael Shellenberger. Welcome back, Michael.
Good to be with you guys.
Okay, so first, tell me about the choice not to declassify these documents. What does it mean, and what do you think the reason behind it is? Do you suspect that there is information that is going to be unflattering to the administration?
I mean, that's definitely the suspicion. And the people that we've been interviewing have said that it is complex to declassify information. You want to both protect the sources and also the methods in which that intelligence was gathered. There was a lot of reluctance on the part of our sources to even describe how the intelligence that they were passing on to us was collected. They were reluctant to even name the 3 patients 0. But ultimately, yeah, this is the information, as Ryan Grim said, that belongs to the American people. It does not belong to the federal government. I think we've seen way too much secrecy around this, secrecy that impeded a proper response to the pandemic, that's impeded getting to the bottom of how it started and how it spread and was allowed to spread so quickly, since obviously having known where it came from might have been a way to stop it spread much earlier, or at least to deal with it. So I think it's a really bad look for the administration to be, behind the 8 ball on this. We're now at least a day past due, and when they had promised to get this information out, it's understandable that these things you have to be done with care, but they've known that they've needed to do this for the last 3 months. So it's hard not to read some potential ulterior motives in this stalling and delaying in the production of this report.
Right, absolutely. Obviously, the deadline was this weekend, so I was hoping to see that information by now. The Wall Street Journal confirming, what you reported a few days ago or last week about, those patients 0. I'm wondering if you've, looking at the discourse on social media or elsewhere, are you seeing people who had disdained the lab leak theory or written it off as a conspiracy theory now that, and maybe they didn't, believe you last week, but now there's also a mainstream media institution has confirmed it as well. I guess it's still theoretically possible that you and the Wall Street Journal were misled and the intelligence was wrong. It seems very much in the realm of extremely unlikely to me at this point. So are you seeing people who had disdained the lab leak theory admitting that they were wrong or that they shouldn't have written it off so easily?
Definitely we're seeing that. And I think it's still dawning on people what a scandal this really was. I mean, I think people need to be reminded that in late January 2020, Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins were told by their top scientific advisors that they thought that was more likely to be a lab leak than to be a zoonotic spillover. And yet a few days later, they were orchestrating what I think can genuinely be called a disinformation campaign, a campaign of propaganda aimed at discrediting the lab leak theory as a so-called conspiracy theory. The original headline in the Washington Post was that Senator Tom Cotton was spreading a discredited conspiracy theory. It was never discredited. There's a long history of lab leaks. There's a new book out by Allison Young that describes that history, where lab leaks, they're very frequent and they had led to past epidemics. So it should never have been written off. I think there's also a an accountability that's required for the mainstream news media, that they went so willingly and unskeptically along with the government line. And then, of course, we also saw that Facebook had censored a New York Post piece in February 2020. It was an op-ed piece simply as someone expressing their opinion that it could be a lab leak. So there's a lot of bad behavior that still needs to be accounted for. I think there is going to be some time for this information to sink in. I think it's a testament to the reason why we should not have government officials out there spreading this kind of propaganda irresponsibly. We need much more transparency, much more quickly. We need the social media platforms to be less obeisant to what government sources are saying. We need the news media to not be so partisan and so dogmatic, or suggesting that somehow because it was first floated by Republicans, that it was somehow a Republican theory. So I do think there's still a lot of a lot of learning that needs to go on, both for the American people and for these very powerful institutions, which really, I think, behaved badly in this particular case.
Yeah, speaking of course, Peter Hotez has been in the news quite a bit recently as he is being pushed and pulled into a potential debate with Joe Rogan. But he is not, this is not the first time that he's been before the public eye. He was someone who quite famously, now notoriously, gave an interview in which he described Jon Stewart's lab leak joke on late night TV as an attack on science. It was characterized by dangerous by a lot of people. I wonder what you make of the public reaction now that lab leak is increasingly confirmed by even mainstream sources.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so. First of all, I think that we need to grow up a little bit in our understanding of both reality and knowledge, meaning science, and how we understand that evolving reality. I mean, look, what we call the coronavirus was actually multiple variants changing over time. The vaccine had different levels of efficacy over time. And we saw, for example, that it did not deliver on either preventing the spread or preventing people from getting sick with coronavirus. It did, I think the evidence shows that it did reduce hospitalizations and death. I'm a supporter of vaccines. But I think this idea that somehow the world stands still and that science evaluates it at one point of time and that stands permanently, it's a really childlike view of science, as is this idea that scientists should not engage in public debates. I mean, here you have someone like Joe Rogan. You go for 3 hours on Joe Rogan. How could you possibly not want to participate in that kind of a forum? It's the opposite of the kind of crossfire debates that you used to see, where you really did have to talk fast and try to get your words in there. 3 hours is plenty of time. And so I think that if you're, so there's a weird mix of arrogance and insecurity here. It's arrogance on the one hand that suggests that because of my position and my credentials, I should be able to decide what other people can read and listen to. But it's insecurity too, in the sense that you don't feel confident enough in your position to be able to defend it publicly.
One of the most vexing aspects of the lab leak discourse for me was the idea that, discussing that theory or preferring that theory was racist, that it was the racially problematic explanation for COVID's origins when compared with the wet market theory. I think this just doesn't make any sense. The wet market involves specifically Asian cultural practices, where the lab leak actually is a theory that there's complicity, certainly with the Chinese government and the laboratory's substandard safety protocols, but also, frankly, of the West and the U.S. government, which funded, which we now know, thanks to a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests from organizations like the White Coat Waste Project. We had a representative of that organization on the show yesterday, showing very clearly that Ben Hu, the now believed to be patient zero, according to your reporting and others, was literally the person named on the grant that was coming from our own health agencies. This was, signed for. This is Fauci is all over this, is involved at the highest levels. I've never been someone who thinks that, Fauci, because he advocated policies I disagree with or something, he should be in jail. He has the right to recommend policies. But to my mind, this does go beyond this. I mean, if this research is responsible or is involved in the origins of a pandemic that killed 10 million people, I would think there would need to be some institutional consequences and also consequences for the individuals who were at the foremost level advocating these dangerous policies.
Well, that's right. And so when you look at the behaviors of Fauci and Collins, those look like behaviors of a cover-up. For it to be a cover-up, of course, that would suggest that their research and their funding, which included skirting President Obama's 2014 ban on gain-of-function research and violating the spirit, if not the letter of that law. But it does look as though that very well may have been a cover-up, and that they may well be responsible for having, if not directly caused, at least contributed to the creation of this pandemic. And so that's a huge story. First of all, that the pandemic appears very strongly to have been human created, that it was created by very powerful individuals who felt that they had the authority to basically violate the law that had been set by the president, that they then afterwards, they covered it up, demonized their opponents as conspiracy theorists and as racists. And, our country just has such a long and tragic history of racism, obviously anti-Semitism, and we start to see those words being abused. And I think that anybody that cares about the progress that we've made in our country on civil rights and that cares about equal rights should be particularly upset and angry when that kind of language is being used to disparage people unfairly. As you said, the notion that the Chinese are all eating bats or that they're eating pangolins, that's a much more racist trope than the idea that the Chinese are not very good at lab security, particularly given that everybody's been bad at lab security. Right. I think there's a lot of reasons to be quite upset about this. We haven't gotten to the bottom of it yet. We do need answers. And I'm with you, Robbie. I don't feel a strong will to punish, but I do have a strong will to get to the bottom of what's going on and get to the truth of this matter. It does matter. It does matter for both just having an understanding of the past, but also to being able to prevent similar kinds of pandemics from occurring in the future.
Michael Shellenberger, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me, guys.